Well, hey, Cascade Church, welcome to another Wednesday's Word. Today, I was planning on talking a lot about that sit, walk, stand metaphor, and I'll get to there about the book of Ephesians. But this morning's reading had Isaiah talking about true fasting. And it's one of my all-time favorites. Sometimes you forget about those little things in Isaiah, but every time I read it, it's just completely blown away. Because God's calling us way beyond externals. In Isaiah's time, they would fast, put on these elaborate religious shows to say that they're sorry, that they're committed to the Lord. But then they would keep going about doing their life just as if God didn't exist, keep exploiting the poor, keep acting unjustly. And so what God is saying is true fasting, the true thing he wants is love, is justice, is taking care of the poor, is putting your evilness aside. And no matter what religious stuff you do on the weekends or every day of your life, if you're not actually changing from the inside, then it's as if God doesn't exist. You're really just worshiping yourself. You're using God as a means, not an ends. You're saying, okay, I want life on my standards, so God, I want you to give it to me. And I'll use your name, I'll use your tools, but I'm not going to change and become like you. And it's devastating. And what we've done in America is we've gotten rid of the fasting, by and large, but sometimes we're not as good at the justice either. So we say, okay, we're not like that. We don't do these big religious, elaborate events, but then we don't do anything. And then we stay in our ways. So sometimes I think we need to do a little bit more of the fasting and soul searching and prayer and Bible memorization. And on top of it, let that change us from the inside. So it's a lot to think about. Another thing I just never noticed before, we had just read the armor of God yesterday in Ephesians. This morning in the reading, it talks about God putting on his own armor. He's putting on what's very similar to what Paul describes in the end of Ephesians. And you tie those together, when we do spiritual warfare, we're stepping into God's shoes. And that fits with what Ephesians has been talking about altogether. When we fight against Satan, standing against him, we're not standing on our own power. What Isaiah is reminding us, and Paul's tying those together, I think intentionally, is that we stand fighting as if God's fighting. Imagine like an Iron Man suit where Tony Stark can't fight Thanos. Tony Stark can't fight anybody. He's just a rich guy. In the comic books, he's a drunk. But he puts on this elaborate external thing, and suddenly he has all this power. Now, take that metaphor, and all metaphors break down at some point, but change it around a bit, where around you is the armor of God. So you're stepping into this bigger thing. But the power source is in you. And I guess Iron Man fits that also. He's got that power source just like tapped into his chest, where he's got a thing there that powers it. We don't have an external thing built into us. We have God changing us from the inside out, and that's how we fight. So when we stand against Satan, when we stand against temptation, when we stand against the evil systems of this world, it's not just us. It's not just the power of Tim or the power of Cascade Church. It's the power of God. The same God that humbled Israel, the same God that destroyed Assyria and Babylon, the same God that brought Jesus from the dead is working through us. And that's how we stand. Long time ago, I read a book written a lot longer than that. Some of the references in the book are from the 1930s by a Chinese Christian named Watchman Nee. And what he does is looks at the book of Ephesians and notices three sections. There's a sit section, a walk section, and a stand section. The very beginning is sitting. We sit down in Christ. It says in Ephesians 2 that we are seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. That's our identity. You've been chosen and loved and predestined. And now you can sit. You can be in the throne room. You have a place at the table with God. So that's your identity. You build and start everything from that security. It is by grace you've been saved, not by works, Paul says, so that no one can boast. In other words, you didn't earn a seat at the table. You didn't fight for it. You don't hold on to it. It was given to you out of love. That should be really encouraging. Now that you're sitting there, based on that identity, now you start to walk in a way worthy of the calling to which you've been called. So we take God's grace and we start walking it out in daily life by loving one another, being kind to one another, tender-hearted toward one another, by raising our children, by loving our parents. All that little stuff is how we walk in this world. The very last section is stand, and it's just Ephesians 6, where we stand against the evil day on the day of evil, and when all things are done, we stand. And in that dichotomy, we see that we don't fight to earn the seat at the table. We don't walk well to earn a seat at the table. Everything's based on that secured identity. Now that we have that identity, now go live. Now that you have an identity, now go fight. We so often get that backwards. So this week, really think about that inward revolution. Paul, Isaiah, God, they're calling us to a true fasting, a true discipleship, a true change that starts on the inside. You can't throw on some, loose armor, hoping it fits, like David wearing Saul's armor, going to fight Goliath. Instead, that inward revolution that changes us from the inside, we step into God's power and we change the world. So let's do that together. Love you all. Talk to you soon.